Are there others desiring to speak before I recognize the Senator from Marshall to close debate? If not, the Senator from Marshall to close debate on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a few brief remarks. I know it's Friday. Nope, Mr. President, when I was 12, I remember me and my buddies, we used to walk the 6 blocks to school every day. We would walk down the street, and one day there was a new kid in town that shows up, and of course he was a little different. He had glasses, a little scrawny, little, and walked a little funny, maybe perceived to be a little feminine. We'd walk down the street, and there was a particular bully in town by the name of James. But he'd go over first couple times, and he would see Donald, the new kid, first couple days, and go over and knock the books out of his hand. And he gathered him up, and the kid kept walking. Very next day, goes over and knocks his glasses off. Pretty soon, Mr. President, some of them laughed, some in the group, some laughed. Me, personally, I cringed. I can tell you, Mr. President, but I stood there. But then about the third day, Donald, parents started driving him to school. And within a week or two after that, he was no longer in the school. I wasn't sure where he ended up, Mr. President. A few years later, a reunion, another function back in my community, I had an opportunity to run into him, and I said, I think I do remember you. I said, you do? He said, you do. I said, I have 2 questions. He says, whatever happened to James, the bully? It didn't surprise any of us when I said he's now serving life without. But secondly, he looked at me, Mr. President. He looked at me and said, why didn't you make him stop? Why didn't you help me? And I'll tell you, Mr. President, the answer was pretty easy, but I didn't have the courage to. I was afraid people would laugh at me, ridicule me, maybe even beat me up. You know, Mr. President, just 2 months ago, I nominated you for the position and remarking about your character and your strength. And I noted in my remarks at that time, Mr. President, the character had been defined as doing the right thing, and nobody's watching. Equally important, however, and sometimes, Mr. President, much more difficult in the political world, is doing what's right when everybody's watching. Because, Mr. President, the strength in this book, in this Constitution, isn't the protections it affords to the 51%, the 60%, or the 80%, or the 90%. The strength in this book, Mr. President, isn't the protections it affords to the 49%, the 10%, the 1%. That's the strength of this book, Mr. President. We're here, Mr. President, now on the 31st day. We're halfway home. And I'll tell you, Mr. President, if history is any guide, I see where Senate Bill 585 was introduced today, the last one on the list. And if history is any guide, we're probably going to get about 700 bills introduced in this chamber. There'll be about 2,000 on the House side. We're going to probably see 2,700 bills. I've been doing this now, Mr. President, for 11 years. So in that period of time, I've seen tens of 20,000, 30,000, and you count the rules, 50,000 bills, 50,000 rules. People may ask, well, what's the most important one that you voted on? Today, I suggest it may be 238, Mr. President. You know, I'm reminded of the story in the New Testament. The scribes and Pharisees tried to trick my Lord and Savior. And they approached him and they said, Master, what is the greatest law? And he looked at him and said, there were 2. You love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, thy whole soul, and thy whole mind. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, and much more importantly, love thy neighbor as thyself. That, ladies and gentlemen, that golden rule is nothing more than treating people with dignity, fairness, and respect. Nothing more, nothing less. So, Mr. President, armed with the tenets of those simple truths and surrounded by the love and support of my family, which is my foundation, which is the only family foundation that counts, Mr. President, I will not shrink from nor be silenced by the political other attacks of any group preaches discrimination over dignity, intolerance over fairness, and fear over hope. I will not shrink, ladies and gentlemen. And in your hearts, I think you know, neither should you.